There are moments in life when you discover that everything you thought was real was just a comfortable lie, and everything you dismissed as impossible was the truest thing that ever existed. And for me, that moment came when I heard the clicks echoing from a basement that wasn't supposed to exist, in a mansion where death had learned to hold souls hostage long after their bodies had turned to dust. Science tells us that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed, and the Bible promises that death is not the end but a passage into eternity. Yet neither prepared me for the terrible truth I discovered that night. That life after death isn't always a gentle transition into light, that sometimes souls get trapped in spaces between worlds, imprisoned by human cruelty that operates on frequencies most people are mercifully deaf to. I was just trying to survive, to build a safe future for my daughter, to keep my head down and my extraordinary gifts hidden beneath layers of ordinary existence. But the universe or God or fate or whatever force orchestrates these impossible intersections had other plans for me. What I'm about to share will challenge everything you believe about what happens when we die, will force you to question whether the boundary between life and death is as solid as we pretend it is, will make you wonder about every unexplained cold spot you've ever felt and every inexplicable sound you've ever heard and dismissed as imagination. This isn't fiction designed to entertain you. This is testimony, confession, warning, and invitation all compressed into one story about a night when I had to choose between protecting my child's comfort and saving a stranger's soul, between keeping my spiritual gifts locked away or finally using them for what they were always meant for. The golden camera captured more than photographs, Verena Ashford collected more than antiques, and Orion's desperate clicks were more than random noise. They were proof that life after death is real, that consciousness continues beyond the body, and that sometimes the living are called to fight battles in dimensions most people refuse to acknowledge exist. If you've ever felt the presence of something you couldn't see, if you've ever wondered whether your deceased loved ones might still be aware somehow, if you've ever suspected that science and faith are both telling incomplete versions of a much larger truth, then this story is for you, not just to read, but to carry with you as evidence that the invisible world is just as real as the visible one, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is open doors everyone else is afraid to acknowledge are there. So before you dismiss this as fantasy or paranormal entertainment, ask yourself, what would you do if you could hear the desperate pleas of souls trapped between worlds? Would you walk away to protect your comfortable life? Or would you risk everything to free them? Because that's the choice I faced in the Ashford mansion, and the decision I made didn't just change my destiny. It revealed what life after death really means, and why some of us are given gifts we spend our whole lives trying to refuse. If this story touched something deep inside you, if it made you think about your own spiritual sensitivity or wonder about what really happens after death, then I invite you to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to this channel, because this is just the beginning of the journey, and there are more stories waiting to be told, more souls waiting to be freed, more truths waiting to be revealed about the dimensions most people are too afraid to explore. Nadia had always known there was something different about her, though she never had the courage to admit it out loud. Since childhood, she heard whispers where only silence should exist, felt invisible presences walking beside her in the empty hallways of her grandmother's house. But life taught her that certain truths need to be buried deep, hidden under layers of normalcy and routine, so we can survive in a world that doesn't believe in what it cannot touch. She learned to pretend she was like everyone else, to smile when she should tremble, to ignore the chills running up her spine whenever she passed through places heavy with untold stories. And it worked. For years it worked, until that night at the Ashford mansion, when the first click echoed through the corridor like a call that could no longer be ignored. The sound was mechanical, yet carried something alive within it, as if each camera shot tore a piece of the veil between worlds. Nadia stopped in the middle of the hallway, the tray of canapés trembling slightly in her hands, while the party continued upstairs with its artificial laughter and clinking crystal glasses. It was strange how that click seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, piercing through walls, bypassing the loud music, finding its way straight to her ears, as if it was meant only for her. Her heart raced, not from fear yet, but from that ancestral certainty some souls carry, that they're about to cross a boundary from which there's no return. She knew this feeling, had run from it all her life, but now, in that cold corridor of the city's most luxurious mansion, something inside her whispered that the time for pretending was over. Above, the chandeliers sparkled like captured stars, casting golden light over silk dresses and perfectly tailored suits that cost more than most people earned in a year. The orchestra played Vivaldi with mechanical precision while guests discussed stock markets, summer homes in the Hamptons, and whose daughter was marrying into which old money family, their voices a symphony of privilege that echoed through marble halls. Champagne flowed like water, caviar disappeared from silver platters faster than it could be replaced, and everyone smiled those practiced smiles that never quite reached their eyes. The kind of smile that comes from years of hiding real feelings behind expensive veneers. This was the world Verena Ashford had built, a temple of wealth and status where everything gleamed with perfection, where every surface reflected success, where no shadow was allowed to exist. But Nadia knew, as she moved through the crowd with her tray, that the brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows, and in a house this grand, those shadows had to go somewhere. Below, in the depths of the mansion where no guest would ever wander, where even the regular staff was forbidden to enter, something else existed entirely. The basement had been sealed off years ago, officially for structural renovations that never seemed to finish, though everyone who worked there long enough learned not to ask questions about the locked door at the end of the service corridor. The temperature dropped 10 degrees as you approached it, a cold that had nothing to do with air conditioning and everything to do with the weight of trapped energy, of souls caught between worlds, of screams that never found their way to living ears. Nadia felt it now, even 2 floors above, like a magnetic pull in her chest, like invisible threads connecting her heart to whatever desperation lived in that sealed darkness. The contrast was almost obscene. Champagne bubbles bursting above while something below desperately fought to not disappear completely from existence. And she understood, with a clarity that made her hands shake, that life after death wasn't just some biblical promise or scientific theory, but a terrible reality for those who couldn't find their way to the light. The forbidden basement wasn't just a room. It was a wound in the fabric of reality, a place where Verena had carved out her own rules, defying both the laws of the living and the peace of the dead. For decades, she had used that space for rituals no one dared to name, ceremonies that mixed old occult practices with her own twisted understanding of what lies beyond the veil, always seeking more power, more control, more certainty that death would never claim what she had built. The walls down there had absorbed so much pain, so many final breaths, so many souls caught mid-passage and trapped like butterflies pinned to a board, that the very air had turned thick with despair. Science might explain life after death through quantum physics and energy conservation, but down in Verena's basement, the explanation was far simpler and infinitely more cruel. Some people refuse to let go, and in their refusal they create prisons not just for themselves, but for anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. The basement had become a collector of unfinished stories, a gallery of interrupted destinies, each one feeding Verena's illusion of immortality. Every object in that sealed space carried memory like a recording device. The iron chair where victims had been photographed in their final moments, the shelves lined with jars containing personal belongings of the departed, the circle of salt and ash permanently stained into the concrete floor where Verena had commanded spirits to reveal secrets of the afterlife. The energy was so dense you could taste it, metallic and rotten, like old blood mixed with fierce sweat, and anyone sensitive enough would feel their chest tighten just standing near the locked door upstairs. This wasn't haunting in the Hollywood sense, with floating sheets and rattling chains. This was systematic spiritual imprisonment, a methodical harvest of souls too confused or too weak to break free from the gravitational pull of Verena's will. The Bible speaks of valleys of shadows and places where light struggles to reach, but it never mentions what happens when someone deliberately builds such a place, brick by brick, ritual by ritual, photograph by photograph. Now that basement existed as a black hole in the mansion's heart, pulling everything toward it, and Nadia could feel its hunger even through the floors and walls that separated her from its depths. The golden camera wasn't something Verena had bought at an antique shop or inherited from some eccentric ancestor. It had been crafted specifically for her by a man who understood that technology and spirituality were never meant to be separate. Built in 1924 by a Russian mystic who fled the revolution with nothing but his tools and his terrible knowledge, the camera was designed to do what no ordinary lens could: capture not just light reflecting off surfaces, but the light that emanates from within, the luminous signature every soul carries as proof of its existence beyond flesh. The brass body was engraved with symbols that predated Christianity, ancient Hebrew prayers with alchemical formulas, creating a language that spoke directly to the space between life and death. When Verena first held it, she felt the weight of its purpose, understood immediately that this wasn't a tool for preserving memories but for stealing futures, for freezing souls mid-journey and keeping them tethered to this plane where she could study them, use them, drain them of whatever secrets the afterlife refused to share willingly. The camera didn't just take pictures. It took pieces of eternity and trapped them in silver and shadow. Every click was a theft, every photograph a prison sentence handed down to someone whose only crime was dying within range of its lens. The film inside was treated with compounds no laboratory would admit to possessing: crushed grave dirt from 7 continents, water from places where miracles were said to occur, ash from burnt pages of forbidden texts, all suspended in an emulsion that could hold more than images. Science talks about life after death as energy transformation, consciousness persisting in quantum states, but the golden camera proved something far more unsettling. That consciousness could be interrupted, paused, held against its will in a state between existence and non-existence. Those captured by its lens didn't move forward into whatever awaited beyond, didn't dissolve peacefully into the cosmic fabric. They remained aware, trapped in a photographic limbo, able to perceive but unable to act, watching the world continue without them while they screamed silently from within their golden prison. The Bible promises eternal rest for the faithful, but Verena's camera offered only eternal waiting, a purgatory of her own design where she played God with other people's afterlives. And now, somewhere in the depths of that forbidden basement, the camera was clicking again, calling out to the one person who might hear its victims and finally set them free. Orion had been 17 when the camera found him, though time meant nothing anymore in the place where he existed now. Not alive, not dead, just endlessly suspended in the terrible moment between taking his last breath and whatever should have come next. He had been a photography student, ironically enough, drawn to the Ashford mansion by rumors of Verena's legendary collection of antique cameras, hoping to see them, maybe even photograph them for his senior thesis on the evolution of imaging technology. He never imagined that one of those cameras would photograph him instead, capturing not his face but his essence, freezing his soul mid-departure like a butterfly pinned to velvet before its wings could fully open. Now he floated in a dimension that science could barely theorize about and the Bible described only in metaphors, a gray space where thoughts echoed but had no substance, where he could see the living world through a fog of increasing thickness, feel himself becoming more transparent with each passing day. Life after death wasn't supposed to be like this, wasn't supposed to hurt, wasn't supposed to feel like drowning in slow motion while everyone who loved him moved on without knowing he was still there, still screaming, still begging to be released or destroyed completely. The worst part wasn't the isolation or even the pain of gradual dissolution. It was the awareness, the crystal-clear consciousness that observed his own fading like a scientist watching a specimen die under a microscope. Orion could feel pieces of himself peeling away like old paint, memories disappearing into static, emotions dulling until even terror became a distant echo of what terror used to feel like. He watched his parents hold his funeral, watched his girlfriend cry herself sick every night for months, watched his little sister refuse to enter his room for 2 years, and he couldn't reach them, curtain flutter or a light flicker the way ghosts were supposed to in movies. The golden camera had him locked so completely that he existed in a parallel track to reality, able to perceive but never to touch, a consciousness without agency trapped in Verena's collection like a rare specimen in formaldehyde. Science spoke of life after death as energy persisting in new forms, but Orion's energy was stuck, recycling endlessly in the same small space, growing weaker with each cycle until soon. Maybe days, maybe hours, there would be nothing left of him at all, not even enough substance to qualify as a ghost. And in his desperation, in his final attempt to not disappear completely from all planes of existence, he had learned to manipulate the one thing he still had connection to, the camera that imprisoned him, making it click at frequencies that certain sensitive souls might hear and recognize as the plea for help it truly was. Nadia's gift had been passed down through 3 generations of women in her family, though no one ever called it a gift. It was always the sensitivity. Spoken in whispers, treated like a hereditary illness rather than an extraordinary ability to perceive what most humans were mercifully blind to. Her grandmother had it strongest, could walk into a room and immediately know if someone had died there, could touch an object and feel the emotional residue of everyone who'd held it, could hear the prayers of departed souls as clearly as living voices on the telephone. Her mother had it too, though she fought against it with therapy and medication and eventually alcohol, trying to drown the voices that science couldn't explain and the Bible only made more frightening with its talk of spirits and demons and the thin veil between worlds. By the time Nadia was born, her mother had one firm rule. Never acknowledge it, never speak of it, never let anyone know you can sense things others can't, because the world doesn't reward sensitivity. It punishes it, calls you crazy, locks you away, makes you doubt your own perception until you're not sure anymore what's real and what's imagination. So Nadia learned to build walls inside her mind, thick ones, to create barriers between herself and the constant whisper of the unseen, to function like a normal person even though she could feel the weight of every unfinished story that crossed her path. But gifts like hers don't disappear just because you refuse to use them. They only go dormant, waiting for a moment when the need is too great to ignore, when someone's desperation reaches a frequency that no wall can block. Tonight, in the Ashford mansion, Orion's call had found the cracks in Nadia's carefully constructed defenses, slipping through like water through stone, reawakening abilities she'd spent 20 years trying to bury. She could feel him now, not just hear the camera clicks but feel the texture of his fading existence, sense the specific quality of his terror. Young, confused, still holding on to the belief that someone would save him even as he dissolved into nothing. It was the same sensitivity that let her know which guests upstairs were genuinely happy and which were performing happiness, which marriages were solid and which were held together by contracts and conveniences, which smiles hid grief and which hid guilt. Science might call it heightened empathy or unconscious pattern recognition. The Bible might call it a spiritual gift or a dangerous opening to demonic influence, but Nadia knew it was simply the truth. That life after death wasn't some distant concept but an immediate reality happening all around, every moment, in layers most people couldn't perceive but she could never fully escape. And now, standing in that corridor with champagne laughter floating down from above and desperate clicks echoing up from below, her gift was no longer asking permission. It was demanding she finally use it for what it was always meant for, helping those trapped between worlds find their way home. Verena Ashford hadn't built an empire by being careless about who she allowed into her world, and she had noticed Nadia from the very first night the young woman came to work at the mansion. Noticed the way she hesitated near certain doorways, the way her eyes would lose focus as if listening to something no one else could hear, the telltale signs of someone touched by the same sensitivities Verena had spent decades exploiting. Most people with such gifts were easy to control through fear or money, but Nadia had proven resistant to both, maintaining a quiet distance that Verena found both intriguing and threatening. So she had done what she always did when direct control failed. She found leverage, and in Nadia's case, that leverage had a name, a face, and attended third grade at Riverside Elementary School. Avellini was 8 years old, bright as summer morning, with her mother's dark eyes and a laugh that could fill an entire room with light. And Verena had made sure Nadia understood, without ever stating it directly, that the scholarship paying for Avellini's private education, the medical insurance covering her asthma treatments, the generous stipend that allowed them to live in a safe neighborhood instead of the projects, all of it flowed from Verena's goodwill. The unspoken message was clear as crystal. Stay blind to what happens in this house. Keep your sensitivity locked away. Ask no questions about locked doors or strange sounds, and your daughter thrives. Become curious, and watch everything you've built for her crumble into dust. The manipulation was masterful because it never required direct threats. Verena simply had to mention Avellini's name occasionally, ask how she was doing in school, comment on how wonderful it must be to afford good health care in this economy, and Nadia would feel the invisible chains tighten around her choices. It was the same tactic Verena had used on dozens of others over the years, the understanding that people will endure almost anything, ignore almost anything, if it means protecting their children from harm. The Bible spoke of testing faith through trials, but this wasn't divine testing. This was calculated cruelty, the weaponization of a mother's love against her own moral compass. Science might explain life after death through physics and energy, but it had no formulas for measuring how much of your soul you could compromise before you stopped recognizing yourself in the mirror. Every night Nadia went home to Avellini, helped her with homework, tucked her into bed, kissed her forehead and promised her the world would be kind. She felt the weight of her own silence about what lurked in the Ashford mansion's depths. She was trading other people's suffering, Orion's suffering, for her daughter's comfort, and Verena knew that eventually, inevitably, that trade would become unbearable, would force Nadia into a choice where every option meant losing something precious. And perhaps that was Verena's real game all along. Not just to control Nadia, but to watch her break under the impossible weight of choosing between saving a stranger's soul and protecting her own child's future. The cold came first, always, not the natural chill of winter air or air conditioning, but something fundamentally wrong, a temperature drop that had nothing to do with. Couldn't even make a thermodynamics, and everything to do with the presence of something that shouldn't exist in the physical world. Nadia felt it creeping up her spine like fingers made of ice water, spreading across her shoulders and down her arms until the tiny hairs stood up in primal recognition of danger her conscious mind hadn't yet processed. The champagne glasses upstairs continued tinkling. The orchestra kept playing, warm bodies pressed together in their expensive fabrics, completely oblivious to the fact that the hallway where she stood had just dropped 20 degrees in the span of a heartbeat. This was the signature of spiritual manifestation, the way energy from other planes announced itself when it tried to bridge the gap into our reality. By stealing heat, by creating pockets of absolute cold that defied every law of science while simultaneously proving that life after death operated on frequencies most physics textbooks refused to acknowledge. The Bible spoke of the valley of the shadow of death being cold and dark, but it never explained that the cold itself was a form of communication, a way for trapped souls to make their presence known when they had no voice left to scream with. Nadia's breath came out in visible clouds now, hanging in the air like small ghosts of their own, and she watched them dissipate slowly as if time itself had become sluggish in this bubble of otherworldly temperature. She had felt this before, in her grandmother's house when the old woman was teaching her to recognize the signs, in the apartment where her college roommate's father had died 3 years earlier, in churches and hospitals and anywhere death had left unfinished business behind. But this cold was different, more desperate, carrying with it not just the absence of warmth but the active presence of something draining, pulling, trying to use whatever energy it could steal to maintain its fading grip on existence. Orion wasn't just manifesting. He was fighting dissolution with every particle of consciousness he had left, and the cold was the battlefield, the place where his diminishing spiritual energy collided with physical reality and created this impossible zone where both science and faith had to admit their explanations fell short. The golden camera had trapped him in a state where he couldn't fully die, couldn't move forward into whatever awaited in the true afterlife, and so he existed in this liminal space that leaked into the physical world through temperature drops and electromagnetic disturbances and the desperate clicks that only someone like Nadia could recognize as a cry for help. She stood there shivering, not from cold alone but from the terrible understanding that if she walked away now, if she chose Avellini's safety over Orion's salvation, she would carry this cold with her forever. Not in the air around her, but deep in the marrow of her bones where no amount of external heat could ever reach it again. The clicks came faster now, more urgent, forming a pattern that transcended random mechanical noise and became something closer to Morse code from the afterlife. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, the universal SOS translated into camera shutters fired by a consciousness that had learned to manipulate the very device that imprisoned it. Orion had spent what felt like years, though time was meaningless in his trapped state, learning the subtle ways he could still interact with physical reality through the golden camera, discovering that his fading spiritual energy could make the shutter release if he concentrated hard enough, if he poured every remaining fragment of his will into the brass and silver mechanism that held him captive. It was exhausting work that cost him pieces of himself with each attempt, like tearing pages from a book to signal for rescue, knowing that each page torn brought him closer to complete dissolution but having no other choice because the alternative was fading into absolute nothingness without ever being heard. The clicks weren't just sounds, they were pieces of Orion's soul being converted into vibration, spiritual energy translated into mechanical action through sheer desperate determination, each one a prayer that someone, somewhere, possessed the sensitivity to recognize them as what they truly were. Nadia heard them differently than she would hear normal sounds, not just with her ears but with that part of her consciousness that had always been tuned to frequencies beyond the physical, the gift she'd spent 20 years trying to suppress now flooding back with overwhelming intensity. She could feel the intention behind each click, could almost taste the desperation, could sense the young life force behind them growing dimmer with each signal sent, like watching a candle burn itself out to produce light. This was communication from the space between life and death, the place science called quantum indeterminacy and the Bible called the Valley of Shadows. where consciousness existed without form and fought to maintain coherence against the dissolving forces of spiritual entropy. Every click was a choice Orion was making, to spend his remaining existence trying to be heard rather than conserving energy and prolonging his trapped consciousness for a few more meaningless moments. It was the bravest and most heartbreaking thing Nadia had ever witnessed. This boy she'd never met sacrificing his last fragments of self to reach across the dimensional divide and touch the one person who might understand, who might care, who might possess both the sensitivity to hear him and the courage to act. The clicks formed words in her mind now, not through language but through pure emotional transmission. Please. Help. Fading. Please. And Nadia understood with absolute clarity that life after death wasn't some distant theological concept or scientific theory. It was Orion. It was now. It was this desperate soul spending his final moments begging not to be forgotten, not to dissolve into void without anyone knowing he'd fought to stay real until the very end. The choice presented itself with brutal simplicity. Walk away and preserve everything she'd built for Avellini, or descend into that forbidden basement and risk losing it all. The scholarship, the insurance, the safe neighborhood, the future she'd sacrificed so much to secure for her daughter. Nadia stood frozen in the cold hallway, her mind splitting into two opposing forces, each one screaming its own truth with equal conviction. One voice, the practical mother voice that had kept them fed and housed through years of struggle, insisted that her primary duty was to the living child who depended on her, that Orion was already gone, that she couldn't save everyone, that sometimes survival meant making hard choices and living with the guilt. The other voice, older and deeper, the one that sounded like her grandmother and maybe like God or maybe just like her own soul refusing to be silenced anymore, whispered that some things mattered more than material security, that life after death wasn't just about what happened to us but about what we chose to do for others, that Avellini would rather grow up poor with a mother who acted with integrity than rich with a mother who traded someone's eternal suffering for tuition money. Science offered no guidance here. No equation could calculate the relative value of a child's education versus a trapped soul's liberation, and the Bible was no clearer, full of contradictory messages about caring for your family versus laying up treasures in heaven versus the last being first and the meek inheriting the earth. The terrible beauty of moral choice is that it strips away all the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about who we are, forces us to confront the raw truth of our character in moments where there's no hiding behind circumstances or excuses. Nadia realized she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life without knowing it. Every time she'd felt the presence of the dead and turned away, every time she'd sensed suffering and convinced herself it wasn't her problem, every time she'd chosen comfortable blindness over difficult awareness, she'd been rehearsing for this exact crossroads. Verena had counted on her choosing safety, had built her entire manipulation on the assumption that maternal love would always trump spiritual duty, that fear for a child's well-being was the ultimate lever for controlling anyone with a conscience. And maybe Verena was right, maybe 99 out of 100 people would walk away, would justify it beautifully, would convince themselves that protecting your own was the highest morality and that guilt fades with time while poverty doesn't. But standing there in the supernatural cold with Orion's desperate clicks echoing through dimensions, feeling her grandmother's gift burning in her chest like a coal that could either warm her or consume her depending on what she chose to do with it, Nadia understood something that shifted everything. If she walked away now, she wouldn't just be failing Orion. She'd be teaching Avellini, through her silence and inaction, that love could be bought, that principles were negotiable, that the invisible suffering of strangers was an acceptable price to pay for visible comfort. And what kind of future was she really securing if it was built on the foundation of a boy's eternal imprisonment? If every scholarship check was soaked in the spiritual equivalent of blood money, if every peaceful night's sleep was purchased by ignoring screams only she could hear. The choice wasn't really between Avellini's security and Orion's salvation. It was between two different versions of who Nadia would be, who Avellini would become, what kind of life was worth living regardless of its material circumstances. Then she saw it. A flicker at first, barely perceptible, like a firefly struggling in the darkness at the end of the corridor where the basement stairs descended into shadow. The light was golden but wrong somehow, not reflecting off surfaces the way normal light should but seeming to emanate from within the air itself, pulsing with the same desperate rhythm as the camera clicks, growing slightly brighter with each pulse as if something was gathering every fragment of energy it possessed for one final attempt to be seen. This wasn't the peaceful white light people described in near-death experiences, wasn't the comforting glow that supposedly guided souls toward whatever came next. This was the light of resistance, of a consciousness burning itself as fuel to avoid complete extinction, the spiritual equivalent of a dying star going supernova before collapsing into darkness. Nadia had read about this phenomenon in her grandmother's journals, descriptions of souls in their final moments before dissolution, when they used every remaining particle of their being to create one last visible manifestation, a golden farewell that said, "I existed, I mattered, please remember I was here." Science might explain it as bioluminescence or electromagnetic phenomena, some quantum effect of consciousness interfacing with physical reality. But Nadia knew it for what it truly was. Orion's last stand against the void, his final proof that life after death meant something, that he was still real even if the golden camera had stolen his ability to move forward into whatever peace awaited beyond. The light pulsed faster now, more erratically, like a heartbeat becoming arrhythmic, and Nadia could feel through her gift that each pulse cost Orion something irreplaceable, that he was literally converting his memories into photons, his personality into electromagnetic radiation, everything he'd ever been transforming into this desperate golden beacon. Soon there would be nothing left to convert, no consciousness remaining to generate light, and he would slip past death into something worse, complete non-existence, not just the end of his physical life but the erasure of his spiritual essence, as if he'd never been born at all. The Bible promised that God knew every sparrow that fell, that not a hair on anyone's head was forgotten, but Verena's basement proved that human cruelty could create spaces where even divine attention seemed unable to penetrate, where souls could be trapped in technological mystical prisons that operated outside the natural laws of both life and afterlife. The golden light was beautiful and terrible at once, a sunset that meant nothing would follow it, a last glimpse of something precious about to be lost forever. And Nadia understood that she was witnessing something most people never saw, the exact moment when a soul realized it was about to cease existing in any form whatsoever and chose to spend its final energy not on prolonging its own consciousness but on trying to save others from the same fate, trying to expose Verena's crimes, trying to ensure that even if Orion himself disappeared, the truth of what happened in this mansion wouldn't disappear with him. The light was his testimony, his evidence, his accusation, and his plea, all compressed into photons that only someone with Nadia's sensitivity could recognize as a message from the space between life, death, and absolute oblivion. Her hand trembled as she reached for the basement door handle, and the moment her fingers made contact with the cold brass, everything changed. The world tilted sideways, her consciousness split open like a seed cracking, and suddenly she was in two places at once, still standing in the hallway but also somehow inside the basement, inside the camera, inside Orion's trapped existence seeing through his fading perception. The connection hit her like lightning translated into emotion, a surge of someone else's memories and feelings flooding through her nervous system. Flashes of a photography class, a girlfriend's laugh, parents arguing about college tuition, the terrible moment of realizing the camera had captured something it shouldn't have, the grinding horror of consciousness continuing after death but trapped, unable to move or speak or touch anything, watching your own funeral through a lens that wouldn't release you. Science talked about quantum entanglement, particles connected across distance, but this was consciousness entanglement. Two souls suddenly sharing the same awareness, the same pain, the same desperate hope that connection itself might be the first step toward freedom. Nadia gasped, nearly pulled her hand away from the shock of it, but Orion's presence surged through the link with something that felt like please, like don't let go, like you're the first real thing I've felt in so long. And she understood that her touch on the door, her intention to help, had created a bridge between dimensions that the golden camera couldn't completely block. Through the connection she felt everything the Bible and science could never fully explain about life after death. It wasn't peaceful transition or simple energy transformation. It was raw continued existence without the mercy of a body to filter experience. Every sensation amplified, every moment stretched into subjective eternity. Consciousness forced to remain aware without any of the biological mechanisms that usually protect the mind from experiencing too much reality at once. Orion's trapped state was like being buried alive in a coffin made of your own awareness, still able to think and feel and remember but unable to scream loud enough for anyone to hear, unable to move forward into whatever afterlife should exist, unable even to fully die and escape into merciful oblivion. The golden camera had caught him mid-transformation between life and death and frozen him there, a specimen pinned between slides of existence and non-existence, and the worst part was that he could feel himself degrading, could sense his memories dissolving like photographs left too long in sunlight, his personality fragmenting like glass under pressure, his very sense of self becoming less coherent with each passing moment. Through their connection, Nadia understood why the clicks were so desperate. Each one was Orion using precious energy he could never recover, burning pages of his own soul to create sound waves that might reach someone who cared, might bring someone who could finally break the camera's hold and either release him forward into true death or backward into some form of life. Her hand on the door handle became an anchor point, her living energy flowing through the contact into his fading consciousness. And for the first time since his capture, Orion felt less alone, felt something like hope that maybe life after death didn't have to mean eternal imprisonment, that maybe someone finally understood his nightmare and possessed both the power and the will to end it. Through the connection with Orion, images flooded Nadia's mind like a dam breaking. Not just his story but the stories of dozens of others, a gallery of trapped souls that Verena had been collecting for decades, each one a witness to crimes that ranged from financial fraud to something far darker. Something that made Nadia's stomach turn even as her consciousness struggled to process what she was seeing. Verena hadn't just been using the golden camera to study life after death out of academic curiosity. She'd been weaponizing it, capturing the souls of anyone who threatened her empire, anyone who discovered her secrets, anyone whose disappearance needed to look natural while their consciousness remained accessible for interrogation and control. The trapped souls weren't just prisoners, they were batteries, their spiritual energy being slowly drained to fuel Verena's occult practices, their memories being harvested like data from a hard drive, their continued awareness ensuring they could never testify against her in any court of law because legally they were dead, even though their consciousness screamed the truth into a void only someone like Nadia could hear. Science spoke of energy conservation, of consciousness as electrical patterns in neurons, but Verena had discovered something science denied. That consciousness could be extracted, stored, and exploited, that life after death wasn't a metaphysical mystery but a resource to be mined by anyone ruthless enough to break the natural laws separating this world from the next. The basement wasn't just a prison. It was a power plant running on stolen souls, and every photograph in Verena's collection represented not a moment captured but a life interrupted, a death denied, a consciousness trapped in perpetual twilight serving purposes it never consented to. Orion had been an accident, a teenage photographer in the wrong place at the wrong time who'd seen something he shouldn't have. Probably another victim being captured, another soul being added to Verena's collection, and she'd eliminated the witness the way she always did, with a camera that killed without leaving marks, that made people legally dead while keeping them spiritually alive and accessible. The Bible warned about those who sold their souls for earthly power, but it never mentioned those who bought other people's souls, who treated the afterlife like a commodity market where consciousness could be traded and exploited without consequence. Through Orion's memories, Nadia saw flashes of the others. A journalist who'd been investigating Verena's business practices, an ex-husband who'd threatened to expose her past, a housekeeper who'd witnessed something unspeakable, a lawyer who'd gotten too close to the truth. All of them now existed in the same horrifying limbo, their families mourning natural deaths while their actual selves remained conscious, trapped, slowly dissolving in Verena's collection like insects in amber. The golden light pulsing in the darkness wasn't just Orion's last stand. It was a beacon from an entire prison population, souls who'd been waiting years or decades for someone with the gift to hear them, someone with the courage to expose what science called impossible and the Bible called an abomination, someone who could finally prove that life after death was real and that humanity's cruelty could follow souls even beyond the grave. The decision, when it finally crystallized in her mind, felt less like a choice and more like a remembering, as if her entire life had been a winding path leading to this exact moment, this exact doorway, this exact chance to become who she was always meant to be. Nadia realized that every time she'd sensed the dead and turned away, she'd been building a debt to her own soul, accumulating spiritual weight that would either crush her or transform her depending on what she did right now. Her grandmother had tried to prepare her for this, had spent years teaching her that gifts like theirs came with responsibilities that transcended personal safety or material comfort, that being able to perceive life after death meant being called to serve those trapped between worlds, to be a voice for the voiceless and a bridge for the stranded. Science would say she was experiencing a moment of moral clarity, neurons firing in patterns that aligned her actions with her deepest values, but it felt more profound than neurochemistry. It felt like destiny clicking into place, like the universe itself had been waiting for her to stop running from her purpose and finally embrace it. The fear didn't disappear. She was still terrified of what she might lose, still ached thinking about Avellini, still wanted to protect the life they'd built. But now that fear existed alongside something stronger. The absolute certainty that saving Orion wasn't just about him, it was about saving herself from becoming the kind of person who could walk away from suffering just because it was invisible to everyone else. In that moment, with her hands still on the door handle and Orion's consciousness still flowing through their connection, Nadia understood what the Bible meant about being born again. Not in some abstract theological sense, but as a literal transformation of identity, a death of who you used to be and a resurrection into who you're called to become. She would go down those stairs, would confront whatever horrors waited in Verina's basement, would find a way to destroy the golden camera and release every soul it held prisoner. And in doing so, she would become something new. Not just a woman working for survival, but a warrior fighting for something that transcended survival. Not just a mother protecting her child, but a spiritual guardian protecting all souls from predators like Verina. The science of life after death might be studied in laboratories with equipment measuring quantum states and electromagnetic fields, but the practice of it, the actual work of helping trapped souls find peace, that required people willing to step into the darkness armed with nothing but their gifts and their courage. She thought of Avellini, sent a prayer into whatever divine attention might be listening that her daughter would understand someday, that she would be proud rather than resentful, that she would learn the lesson Nadia was teaching through action rather than words, that integrity matters more than comfort, that some calls cannot be ignored without losing yourself completely, that life after death isn't just something that happens to us eventually but something we participate in every time we choose courage over fear, service over safety, love over self-preservation. The golden light pulsed brighter as if sensing her decision, and Nadia felt Orion's consciousness surge with hope so intense it was almost painful, and she knew, with the kind of knowing that comes from places deeper than thought, that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was born to do, and that whatever came next would be terrifying and possibly fatal but absolutely, undeniably right. The door opened with a sound like breaking glass, though nothing shattered except perhaps the final barrier Nadia had kept between her ordinary life and her extraordinary calling, and as the darkness of the stairwell exhaled its cold breath into her face, she felt something fundamental shift inside her consciousness. A door opening in her own soul that could never be closed again. This wasn't just about descending physical stairs into a basement. It was about crossing a threshold that separated those who witnessed suffering and walked away from those who witnessed suffering and walked toward it. And once you made that crossing, once you chose to see what most people refuse to acknowledge, you could never return to comfortable ignorance no matter how much you might want to. Science talked about neuroplasticity, about how experiences reshape the brain's architecture, but this was deeper than neurons rewiring. This was the architecture of the soul being permanently altered, doors opening to dimensions of perception and responsibility that would transform everything about how she experienced reality from this moment forward. The Bible spoke of narrow gates and difficult paths that led to life, and Nadia understood now that those weren't metaphors about heaven but descriptions of moments exactly like this. Thresholds that demanded everything, that promised nothing except the chance to become fully who you were created to be, regardless of cost. As she took the first step down into the darkness, feeling Orion's golden light pulsing stronger now that she was moving toward him rather than away, Nadia sensed other doors opening throughout the mansion, throughout the city, throughout dimensions she'd never had names for. As if her decision to act had sent ripples across multiple planes of existence, alerting forces both protective and predatory that someone had finally chosen to challenge Verina's reign over the trapped dead. Life after death wasn't a passive state, she realized, but an active dimension where choices mattered, where consciousness continued making decisions that affected both the living and the dead, where every soul that chose courage over fear literally changed the fabric of reality in ways science was only beginning to theorize and the Bible had tried to express through inadequate language about angels and demons and spiritual warfare. She could feel her grandmother's presence now, not as a ghost but as a kind of permission or blessing flowing through their shared bloodline, as if 3 generations of women with this gift were converging in this moment, lending Nadia's strength she didn't know she possessed. The door to the basement would never close the same way. Again, even if she survived, even if she somehow defeated Verina and freed the trapped souls, she would carry this threshold experience forever, would always know what it meant to choose the terrifying path over the safe one, would always be the woman who opened doors most people spent their lives pretending didn't exist. And in opening this door, she was also opening herself to gifts she'd suppressed, to purposes she'd avoided, to a destiny that had been waiting patiently for her to stop hiding and finally step into the role only she could fill. Bridge between worlds, liberator of the trapped, voice for those who could no longer speak, living proof that life after death wasn't just a concept to debate but a reality to engage with, fight for, and ultimately transform through nothing more than the decision to care enough to act. So here's what I need you to understand, really understand, not just intellectually but in that place where truth resonates deeper than words. Life after death isn't some distant theological debate or scientific hypothesis waiting to be proven in a laboratory. It's happening right now, all around you, in frequencies most people have trained themselves not to perceive because perception demands responsibility, and responsibility requires courage most of us aren't sure we possess. Orion was real, his imprisonment was real, and there are others like him trapped in spaces between worlds, held captive by people who discovered that cruelty doesn't end with the body's death but can follow consciousness into dimensions where screams make no sound and suffering leaves no visible marks. I did go down those stairs that night. I did confront what waited in Verina's basement, and what I found there changed me so completely that I can never return to the comfortable blindness I once called normal life. And maybe that's exactly what spiritual gifts are meant to do. Not make life easier but make it impossible to ignore the truths that matter most. The question I'm leaving you with isn't whether you believe my story. Belief is cheap and skepticism is easier than action. The question is what you'll do with your own sensitivity, your own moments of inexplicable knowing, your own encounters with the invisible dimensions that brush against your awareness and then retreat when you refuse to acknowledge them. Because I promise you this, if you're watching this video, if something drew you here, if these words are resonating in places deeper than your conscious mind, then you have your own gifts waiting to be claimed, your own doors waiting to be opened, your own Orions desperately hoping someone will finally hear their clicks and care enough to respond. The Bible says that to whom much is given, much is required, and science proves that consciousness is far stranger and more persistent than we ever imagined, and somewhere in the intersection of those truths lies your calling. Not necessarily to fight occult collectors like Verina, but to use whatever sensitivity you possess to make the invisible visible, to speak for those who can't speak for themselves, to be a bridge between the worlds that most people pretend are separate but deep down have always been connected. I want you to do something for me right now, something that might feel uncomfortable but is absolutely necessary. Close your eyes for just a moment and ask yourself what you've been refusing to see, what gifts you've been suppressing, what calls you've been ignoring because answering them would require changing everything about how you live. Feel that discomfort, that resistance, that fear of what might happen if you finally stopped pretending to be normal and started being extraordinary. And then ask yourself whether the cost of staying small is really less than the cost of becoming who you were created to be. Life after death isn't just about what happens to us eventually. It's about what we choose to do for others now, in this moment, with whatever awareness we've been blessed or cursed to carry. Orion is free now, and so are the others who were trapped in Verina's collection. But there are more souls waiting, more people suffering in dimensions you can't see yet but could learn to perceive if you were brave enough to stop running from your own spiritual nature. So I'm going to ask you directly, are you ready to stop pretending? Are you ready to acknowledge that life after death is real, that your sensitivity isn't imagination or mental illness but a legitimate way of perceiving dimension science is only beginning to understand and faith has been describing imperfectly for millennia? Are you ready to open your own forbidden doors, to descend your own dark staircases, to confront whatever truths have been waiting patiently for you to stop being afraid and start being who you actually are? Because if the answer is yes, even a trembling, uncertain yes, then I want you to subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and commit to this journey of spiritual awakening and responsibility. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's been feeling like they're crazy for perceiving things others can't see, someone who's been waiting for permission to finally trust their own extraordinary awareness. Leave a comment telling me about your own experiences with the invisible world, your own moments of knowing things you shouldn't be able to know, your own encounters with what lies beyond the veil. Because we're not alone in this, and the more we speak our truths, the harder it becomes for people like Verina to operate in the shadows. Life after death is real. Your gifts are real. The choice in front of you is real. And I promise you this. The moment you stop running from your calling and start walking toward it, everything changes, not always for the easier but always for the truer, and in the end, that's the only thing that really matters. Welcome to the journey. Let's walk it together.